This is Season 5 of DM Gives Inspiration. Welcome back. Hope all your home games are doing well. Today we're going to talk about teleports and portals, both on the player side and the DM side. And in the background of this conversation, I want you to think about avoiding escalation. And in the briefest sense, escalation here means that when your players start to get new and maybe ridiculous powers, the game doesn't become ridiculous. We need to build a groundwork for spells like teleportation to have a place in the world without just getting silly. But these player abilities will sneak up on you if you're unprepared. And I want you to enjoy those early levels when players are maybe less mobile, less tricky, while still planning and making a world that works later on. Let's take the spell Fly, for example. 3rd level spell, requiring a 5th level spellcaster. Your wizards and spellcasters will be able to jump effectively over a maze you create. Do you then make a set of rules for that maze? There are creatures that only attack players who are trying to cheat the maze. There's a giant crystal in the middle that shoots lasers over anybody trying to scale over a wall. That can work, but we've now added that lore to our world. There are crystals that shoot lasers. As we go on, do the bad guys build flying airships that have crystals that shoot lasers at anything that flies? Why wouldn't they? We've already established this as part of our world. And in that vein, you should enjoy all the pits and jump traps you want until level 7, when suddenly your bards, sorcerers, and wizards are going to have access to Dimension Door, the first real form of teleport they can get. Now, of course, there's bonus action Misty Step available as a 2nd level spell. That's not too big of a concern. That's more of a reposition. Misty Step also has the text that they appear in an unoccupied space. Dimension Door does not have that feature. They can teleport to somewhere where there is stuff or creatures. The spell fails, and they take 4d6 force damage instead. You're basically on the clock. Come 7th level players, 4th level spells, they're going to start avoiding your dungeon. You should let them. You should let them teleport through walls. They're going to feel cute about it. And it takes a rather high-level spell slot for them at that time. Let them feel rewarded, and you can feel rewarded by knowing that you have forced a harder fight later on because they won't have access to that spell slot. Don't be disappointed, and certainly don't escalate your dungeons to be specific counters to those players, such as anti-teleportation fields. But it's not just the dungeons we need to account for. We need to make sure that the cities are teleport ready. Come 9th level, 5th level spells, they're going to be able to access Teleportation Circle, which links to certain locations and allows for group travel through a teleport. Making sure your cities already have teleportation circles means that when we reach that point, we don't have to suddenly add them. There can be political barriers, economic barriers that may have stopped them from interacting and seeing those circles, but they know they exist. In movies, we call them throwaway lines, but they're extremely important. Walking down the street and hearing an NPC say, "The mayor wants to put in a teleportation circle in a low-level town," allows our brains to make room for the future where that'll be part of the player's everyday life. And it always happens with new players. You don't have to have experienced power gamers in order to have a wacky teleportating group. It just happens naturally. They try out Misty Step. That was convenient. They try out Dimension Door in a dungeon. Whoa, hey, well, look how much we skipped. That felt really good. And before you know it, they're asking questions as to why they had to work to save the farmland when the city could teleport food out to the populace. We need to build a framework, even in those early levels, to make sure the world can account for these powerful spells, like teleport. And full-blown teleport comes online for players at level 13, a 7th level slot. Now the players can go anywhere they want with a little bit of danger if they're not that familiar with the location. A permanent circle means they're always on target. They have an associated object with the location, they can be on target. If they're only familiar or seen it casually viewed once, now we're rolling on a table to say if there is a mishap, they end up in a similar area, which can mean miles off, or they're just off target entirely. There is some danger and mystery associated with just teleporting anywhere you want, but returning to somewhere you've already been or somewhere you can link to is no problem at all. Your players will be globetrotters at this point. But 7th level, 13th level, we don't even know if your game's gonna go that long. Let's be sure to answer those questions for ourselves and use our dungeons and our world to establish teleportation as an actual, usable commodity. Something that the world is aware of that exists, even though it may be beyond our understanding. We know there are fighter jets, there are fighter jet pilots. How often do we interact with fighter jets? Not at all, but they need a place in our world. We also want to avoid that video game tooltip moment. And if you've ever played an adventure game, particularly in the last 10 years, you know what I'm talking about. This is where, long ago, at the beginning of the game, you learned to freeze blocks of ice so you could walk on them. Now, 30 hours later in the game, it once again calls for you to freeze blocks of ice so you can walk on them. And the game designers are well aware of the fact that they haven't used this ability so far, so they have to remind you of what button makes this happen. That feels bad. And we want to do the same thing on our way two-dimensional door, where you could take damage. We want to do the same thing on our way to teleport, when things can go awry. Add those rules to your world, and add your own rules on top of it. There's lots of rules for how teleportation works on paper for a spell, but there's nothing standardized about how teleportation works in your world. You need to establish that. So what does teleportation feel like? Is it hot, wet, squishy, uncomfortable, like pushing through Jell-O? Is there a visual associated with it? Or is it like stepping through a door? Going through a window? You wouldn't even know you teleported unless someone told you. Each one of those is really interesting and can affect our dungeon design. And adding portals in your early dungeons once again enforce that this world is full of teleportation. But let's use those elements to standardize what teleportation feels and looks like. You have a portal in a dungeon, a great way to divide up the space. Plus, if you roll out a mat with a dungeon drawn out and it's just isolated boxes that players are going to be teleporting between, there's a lot of mystery associated there. There's very little metagaming that the players can do. You're also forcing strong decisions if you use portals that only go one way. They have no idea what's in the next room. For those portals, would you allow arcane checks to detect the location? What about detect magic? Could that tell you where the portal goes? What sort of information can your players gather before stepping through a mysterious doorway? Can you stick your head through? Or is touching the portal activation? What happens if your players hold hands? Let's say you set up a portal that delivers people to a room in random locations, spreads them out for an upcoming fight. A cool tactical moment. If they are divided after passing through that portal, a very likely result, a counter to that, will be the players saying, well, that they all jump through at the same time. They all hold hands. Do you make them roll athletics checks to hold hands as hard as they can as they're whipped around by the arcane winds and the teleporter? Now, there isn't any standardization when it comes to permanency of spells. Portals and teleportation that is not a player spell is of our own design as DMs. which means you also need to decide how a teleportation circle or a portal can be destroyed. Can it be destabilized by messing with the actual physical archway or the circle on the ground? Is there a gatekeeper, the caster somehow channeling it for all time, and if they die or are interrupted, does the portal fail? Can you dispel magic on it? Can you use an anti-magic field? It's a game of rules, Dungeons & Dragons, and by establishing strong early rules, your late game is going to be amazing. What if you established early on that dispelling a portal or interrupting a teleportation ritual unleashed a huge amount of raw magic? What if it summoned a monster from another plane? What if that monster was from between the planes? Your players in the late game may know how to destroy a city by messing with its teleportation circle instead of just doing raw combat. That'll feel very rewarding when we get there. And you can go deeper as well. What's it like in that world between worlds? When you teleport, even though it may be instantaneous, if we slowed it down, would it be its own place? If you introduced an artifact that allowed players to see that world between worlds, what would they find there? What if they had to talk to someone who was banished, lost to the multiverse, trapped in that world between worlds after a failed teleport? It's creepy thinking that every time you went somewhere, you rubbed shoulders with someone you never met, flew past someone's view. That after all these teleports, this NPC they're searching for would have seen them hundreds of times. But you're the dungeon master. You're not limited by portal archways and teleportation circles. You could just have teleportation paths that you establish for one particular dungeon early on to just get that flavor out there. What it's like to reposition with a clear layout. These could be part of the dungeon design or even left by a previous explorer, a previous adventuring party that failed but managed to set up these particular elements. You could also host a boss that has a forced teleportation mechanic. You could reposition players randomly on a grid with chaos magic. You could have the boss have a mid-fight phase switch where they teleport everybody to nearby cells where they have to fight a zombie before they can escape. After traveling far and climbing a long, exhausting staircase, the players finally get to talk to the sage. Upon being rude to him, the sage waves his hand, casting teleport and banishing them back to the bottom of the staircase. Well, now we've worked in teleport as a role-playing element. Players that don't follow the rules laid down by the major domo are teleported away, dismissed from the conversation and not allowed to participate for a time. Once you have rules laid out that players have experienced with enough regularity that they can understand them, then we can break those rules in interesting ways. In a late game dungeon, it can be very fun to add an illusionary portal. What if in the mid-high levels, we made a portal that looked like a pillar of fire? And when the players stepped into the pillar of fire, they were teleported, but there was an illusion that they were burned alive. You pass that player a piece of paper that says, "You're fine, you're just in the next room, please be quiet." But the rest of the players all have to deal with what just happened before their eyes. That's a showstopper. It's a cute idea, but it would just stop a game in its tracks. But because we have the previous experience with that arcane check or detect magic, whichever you may have chose, that is a playable field now. But we're always going to bring it back to avoiding heavy world escalation. The teleport spell states that if the target is an object, it must be able to fit entirely inside a 10-foot cube. Well, it's not that far of a bridge to cross to say, well, let's get 10 level 13 wizards together. They can all cast teleport at the same time, and we could shoot a whole 100-foot boat through time and space. If we take that idea and we industrialize it, we are no longer in Dungeons and Dragons. Wizards, NPCs, become robots, become bureaucrats that are teleporting castles in the sky. This should be a player idea. They should have to seek out 10 wizards of such great power. If there are that many wizards sitting around in office jobs, what's special about our level 7 heroes? If there's so many high-level wizards available, why don't they take care of the world's problems? Is it like a Superman-Batman situation where they just don't interact with each other? Or is Superman's busy on a cosmic scale? Maybe. But we're getting silly. This is why the dark ritual that no one would dare perform to summon an evil god works, and industrializing teleportation doesn't. Allow room for these cool ideas. That's a great player idea to let them have. But don't fall into the pit trap of making your world a magical bureaucracy. Players' brains will become disconnected from your threats because they could be solved with non-adventuring parties. Plan ahead and let your players be the force of change if your world is going to advance. And teleportation will always be a part of this problem. And thank you for joining me for the first episode of Season 5 of DM Gives Inspiration. There's lots of inspiring topics we're going to be going over this season, but of course, just like your player levels, those episodes will be upon us sooner than you think. Send questions to the show using the contact link at kylefergusson.com, 2 S's in Fergusson. You can also join the Discord that is listed on that site and post questions there instead. You can also find me on Twitter at Kyle Fergusson. Music for the show was by Brian Griffith. The show is supported by the patrons over at patreon.com/Kyle Fergusson. I'll see you next week with a new topic for DM Gives Inspiration.